Anyway, thank you guys so much for coming here tonight. So this salon, does God need an R&D department? But we're also going to talk about ritual. For those of you who don't know me, and actually most of you do, but I know there's a handful of you who don't know me, my name is Susan, and this is my home, so I'm happy to have you here this evening. And this sounds a little weird. Is it a little echoey over there? Anyway, I'm happy to have you here this evening, and I'm co-hosting with Andrew Serazin. We haven't done this for a long time. Andrew is the president of the Templeton World Charity Foundation, and I feel at this point we literally are an entertainment team for these sorts of conversations.
I've seen the morning show.
Yeah. But we're thrilled because we have a grant from Templeton for conversations like these and for building community. And this is our third year of collaborating together and having all sorts of cool evenings, basically kind of around the world, starting off in Svalbard. A few housekeeping things. What's your Instagram handle for anyone? This is totally on the record. Why wouldn't it be?
Mine?
Yes.
At Casper TK _.
There you go. Templeton is Templeton World on
Correct.
Instagram. Yep, and I'm MacTavish Best and at Posthoc Salons. Other housekeeping things before we get started. Appreciate the musicians. Woo! Yeah. Musicians, I mean, we've all had a shitty couple of years, but musicians certainly have, and one thing we love at the Posthoc Salons is to be able to support musicians and have different musicians here. Your plates, we're not serving you. I did cook for you, but please move your plates to the kitchen. That's another housekeeping thing. And I think that's it. I can't think of any other housekeeping things. Quick introduction of Andrew. Like I said, he's the president of the Templeton World Charity Foundation, and he's a scientist. Are you a biochemist? No. Anyway, he's a scientist. He's an entrepreneur. He's a friend. He's a dad. He's a husband. And he's just a really great friend. And he's super curious.
Well, thanks, Susan.
You're welcome, Andrew. And Casper, I don't know at all. But he's from Sussex. And he was a climate activist who was an atheist and gay and thought, I'm going to rock up to Harvard Divinity School. So people might have been confused. But he's an extreme podcaster and author of the book, The Art of Ritual.
Power of Ritual.
Power
Yes.
of Ritual. And right there. I know. See, I knew this was going to happen. And you're the co-founder of Sacred Design Lab, which we're going to find all out about. But do you want to talk a little bit of
Well, I just want to say thank you to you, Susan, for cooking for us. The food has been amazing. The atmosphere is wonderful. You look glamorous as always.
Thank you.
It's just great to be back here. Specifically, it's been almost 2 years. You've been showering outside, in Northern California.
I've been living in this off-the-grid couch.
I've been on an island, in the Caribbean for 2 years.
I'm really the odd one out with a.
Yeah, Casper, what's your?
Brooklyn.
It's a wasteland of sorts. Anyway, sorry. So just thank you, Susan, and just a little bit about Templeton World Charity Foundation. I think sort of people ask about us about the pandemic and how it changes our approach to philanthropy. We're a funder of research, policy, and practice, all related to the subject of human flourishing. And the past 2 years have taught me that this is the most important question today. And these are questions we've been asking ourselves for the past 2 years. What do we value and why? What do we believe in and why? Who do we surround ourselves with and why? How do we create communities that support us and reinforce us? And so in short, how do we flourish and not just survive? And so, I was reminded about the sort of introduction of today's conversation with Casper, which is sort of taking these two things, which is the human search for meaning and purpose and truth, and mashing that up with data and experimentation and product design. And on the way over here from my hotel, I was listening to Christmas carols. I had passed I'm a Catholic. I had passed a church. I'd seen mindfulness app advertisements, and on the way home, I'm going to read Harry Potter. And so these, meanwhile, like sort of interested in peyote and psychedelic research, right? So all of these things, which we sort of take from different cultural traditions. This is fueled by technology, and we're remixing all of these things in our life today. And we're dabbling with different things, and there's nobody on the planet that I think is more in touch with that process of combining spirituality and faith and meaning and purpose. There's nobody that's more in touch with that than Casper. And so we're super excited about work together with you at Sacred Design Lab. And it's just a cool topic because it's something that I think speaks to all of our hearts, and hopefully we can all learn a little bit about how we navigate these questions with aided by the work you do. So take it away, guys.
Wow, no. So this, for those who haven't been here before, it's really just a conversation. Sometimes we throw out questions. So a quick quote from Casper's book. In many ways, the understanding of religion over the last few hundred years is an anomaly. Because the West has been deeply marked by a Protestant Christian understanding, we assume religion is all about what you believe. That's part of it, of course. But most of the world, and certainly most of history, point to a different way of thinking about religion, and that's about what you practice. So my first question is religion declining, or is it morphing into a less monotone sort of spirituality?
Yeah. Well, good evening, everyone. Hello.
Easy question, Casper. Let's just jump into it.
I hope I won't offend anyone. Yes, religion is not declining. Religion is transforming. We look at all the data of affiliation and church membership and all of the kind of obvious headlines, and all of those are going down, except Islam through immigration and Buddhism, mostly through people becoming Buddhists.
Is Buddhism going up, or is it going down?
It is slightly.
It is going
yes,
up, very slightly, yeah.
Everyone else, but it's through a very limited set of metrics that we understand religion. And so if you're only looking at attendance or how often people identify as a particular tradition, like Andrew was saying, I'm Catholic, then we only see part of the story. When you look at where people are going to explore the questions of ultimate meaning, how they make sense of death and suffering, and even if those places might be unexpected, like a CrossFit gym or a Headspace app or a hiking club or a Beyonce concert, what's happening in those places I think is profoundly spiritual, if not religious, even if we don't necessarily narrate our lives through those traditional channels. And Andrew pointed to this mixing idea, which I think is really powerful to help us make sense of what's happening, because we tell the story of religion often as a consistent kind of pneumatic tube through history. Christianity started here, and 2,000 years later, now we're here. But that's completely false. Every religion interacts with cultures and economies and other religions near and around it, sometimes in conflict. But they shape one another. And so in an age where, aided by the internet, we are encountering one another at incredible speeds and scales, those things too are mixing and adapting and encountering one another. And so no longer can many people say, oh, I'm just Jewish, or I'm just this. It's like, well, my dad was this, my mom was this, I use that app, I go on this retreat, but I'm always home for the holidays. And that is a kind of mosaic, a bricolage, the scholars might say, as I drop my microphone, literally.
What does it mean for religious institutions as people are sort of making a patchwork of their own spirituality? Like a little bit of Peloton over here, a little bit of trail running, a little bit of Posthoc.
Yeah, exactly. Just a dash. Every 2 years.
I think we need some incense actually here.
I meant to burn some earlier out on the street. I meant to.
For those of you who don't know, she actually burns the meat first, so that it's sort of it all comes out. So that as you enter, it's this.
I
like,
do that on
yeah,
purpose and set the
just to let
smoke
you know
alarm.
what's up.
Okay.
Now I've completely forgotten the question.
No, the question is what's happening. What's traditional
happening with the
religions?
Yeah,
Like
because everyone's patching things
Yeah.
and
together
because you
these
work
days.
with Sacred
Yes.
Design Lab, you actually work with these
Yeah.
mainline traditions, and so I think you have a great
Yeah.
viewpoint on what's happening inside them.
There's a real scale, I would say, in terms of how religious institutions respond. No doubt there are many, if you think about evangelical Christianity, for example, certainly the Catholic Church by and large, there's a real sense of hold on to what we have, of maintenance, of kind of closing ourselves
When you say
off.
hold on, are you meaning cling?
Yes,
Okay.
desperately.
Okay. It was very delicate that you were saying that. I felt like we needed to
Well,
get a
and-
better
and-
understanding.
There's even the Benedict option, it's called, within Catholic circles, you might be familiar with this, of literally kind of retreating from the world. You know, the world is lost, let us stay safe and close to one another. So that certainly is one reaction. The ones I'm most interested in are religious leaders who, for one reason or another, have enough faith in the wisdom of their own tradition that it will change in a way that is that has integrity. And so even if we might not have as many buildings as we did, or even if ordination doesn't look like it used to, that in their language the Spirit of God lives in a way that will still be faithful. So the best example for me are actually Catholic nuns, because they are so close to the kind of precipice of disappearance. You know, there used to be 400,000 women religious.
How many
nuns.
are there now?
Like
Well,
just
in the United States,
in
'cause
the- in
actually
the United
in
States.
Africa, there's
still many.
millions.
And
Yeah,
how many
yeah.
in the United States?
In the United States, there's now less than 40,000, and the average
It's
age.
good I have an option for career.
Well,
You know,
There are
I gotta like the salon business, you never know. It's like,
there are strict entry requirements. I'm not sure you
we all have different chapters
What
in
would
life.
we do?
We all have different chapters in
You know,
life.
I'm struggling to figure out like what would be the hardest for me. I'm not.
Do you know what? I think we all immediately think about sex. But I
Obedience. It's
I
obedience
think
for
it's
me.
obedience.
I think
Yeah.
the obedience.
and poverty, which often we think about, you don't have anything, but it's more about common ownership.
Yeah.
And I think in a society where we're so focused and forced to focus on what is mine and
And
how
the
do I get ahead,
individualism
and
versus,
exactly,
you know, yeah.
that it's massively countercultural to submit to that kind of community living. Because we will say in rooms like this, oh, community, isn't it wonderful? We love building community. Community is fucking awful. Like, people are shit.
Say more about
No,
that.
like, I,
We both went to British sleepaway schools.
exactly.
Yeah,
Oh my god.
The fagging system.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh yeah, I was deep in it.
People are trash. But
I loved it actually.
no, I love them too. But when you get close and you have to stay close to them, you see all of the frustrations and the ugliness and the
Yeah,
selfishness,
yeah.
not just in other people but in ourselves.
Pack animal thing.
Exactly.
So
And so that's why I love and respect these women so much, because essentially what they say is, yes, our form of religious life is dying, right? They ran hospitals, they ran education systems, no longer. But they talk in their language that the charism of those communities, the kind of the inciting dream and the commitments to certain values that those communities hold dear, they trust that that is still alive in the world. It just looks completely different than it did for them.
So tell us more about how you at Casper got into all of this.
The atheist gay guy
yeah.
who was a climate activist.
Climate,
It was
yeah.
like, ooh,
And so you know you rock up to Harvard Divinity School.
What did you find
and-
there?
Yeah. What?
What was that like?
I found myself.
And we're all here to hear this.
Let's do tell.
Well, there's two parts of the story. One is, so I grew up in a village in a Waldorf school. Does anyone know Steiner education, Waldorf? Yeah.
I don't know.
So it's a very...
I'm from Ohio.
Yeah, you're from
That's
Ohio.
right. I thought he was joking.
We have some Ohioans here. Where are the Ohioans?
Where are the
at?
Ohio
Yeah, there we
people?
go. All right,
Come on,
guys.
come on,
Yeah.
yeah.
Awesome.
Is that the
Fantastic.
Buckeye state?
You got it, buddy. Yeah.
My husband is from Kentucky, and so all I know is like, yes. But is it Louisville or is it Lexington? Wow. Louisville. No, go Wildcats. Anyway, so there are two strands. One is this Waldorf School, which, for those of you not familiar, is really a descendant of Rudolf Steiner, who was this very interesting man talking about mixing. His kind of theological project was to bring Hinduism and Christianity together in the early 20th century. But what came out of his work was this education system really focused on the holistic development of the child. So I didn't learn to write until I was 10, but I could have recited French poems and danced and made
Very
alphabet.
hippy-dippy.
Yeah,
Very hippy-dippy.
So all of which is to say, that school was very, very rich in its ritual.
I see,
So
yeah.
on May Day we danced around a maypole, and on Michaelmas we made lanterns and sang in the street, and on Christmas Eve, and I will be back in England to do this in just a few weeks, we go to all the different barnyard animals on the local biodynamic farm, and we sing them Christmas carols.
Very
Now, hold on a second. So, like the cows, do they get a certain?
Absolutely.
What do they get?
Absolutely.
What do they get? Like first Noel?
Well, they like Hark the Herald. And then the chicken...
Anything with a manger, I think, gets priority there.
That's true.
But, okay.
Anyway, so that was the childhood I grew up with, which was very rich in practice, but very... without a sort of imposition of theological doctrine. I've become much more open to what doctrine really is, but at that point, certainly as a gay kid, it felt very free. So that was one strand of life. And then the other strand was going to a boarding school and being horrifically bullied, as every queer kid is in a boarding school, and feeling just horrifically lonely. And that sense of isolation and disconnection and just longing to belong was incredibly strong. And so I found that in the climate movement, of all places, and got really involved in mobilizing young people around the UN climate negotiations.
Was it disappointing at all?
Well, I had a bit of a breakdown.
Okay.
Who doesn't if you work in the climate
Right,
movement?
okay.
Because you come up so close to the horrors of what is and what is to come, and the smallness of our individual lives, that I think it forces these existential questions. And so that's how I ended up in divinity school, because what I felt able to do, even as an activist, compared to the scale of the problem as I understood it, was so overwhelming that I started to move away from how do we stop climate change from happening to how do we adapt to the reality of a changed climate. And so the question I was always asking myself is, who has thought about how to make sure that we welcome the stranger, the climate refugee, the person who arrives at our doorstep, who is coming? And that's when I thought more and more about religion.
What's the difference between, I think I know, between habit and ritual, and habits, I think a lot of habits in my life, and I'm sure in most of our lives, you start out you make it a habit to say exercise or go trail running, and then it becomes a ritual as you get older.
How did you notice that difference when it changed?
I didn't until I was reading your book. I didn't, other than it's extremely, I have these things that are very important to me. I went to a Scottish boarding school and it was a lot of ritual, as he was just saying. And I just thought I was very disciplined, actually. But I think maybe I just like the ritual and I'm not remotely disciplined. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sure you are.
But I think it goes over. When you're 22, you go exercise 6 days a week because you're going to look good in your jeans. And then as time goes on, that time in nature becomes a ritual, and like you turn on certain music or you put away your phone, and it becomes something you look forward to. Actually, even today I went up to Equinox. I've been there for a while because I just came into town. I was like, actually, this is a ritual. This isn't a habit. I just want to be around other people. I'm there for like 11 minutes. But it's a great little chapter in my day that I'm very disciplined to do, and yeah.
I love that you say chapter in your day, because I think one of the purposes of ritual is to give structure to time.
Absolutely.
And so when we think, John O'Donoghue, who was a wonderful poet and priest, talked about a holy life is a life in rhythm. And I think that's one of the things in a kind of overworked culture and all the things that we navigate, that we miss those moments that interrupt us.
Well, they make us feel safe, right?
Exactly.
Particularly in these wobbly, the last couple of years, everyone's felt a little bit wobbly, and I think rituals
ground us.
Yeah, it's like everything else might be shit, but at least I know this is here for me every day.
And that's what they're there for, to help us navigate uncertainty.
Do you have some rituals, Andrew?
I have some rituals.
What do you do before dinner? Or
Yeah.
You have
So
like kid time or
yeah,
something.
definitely. We
That's
have this thing.
probably
We have this
become a
thing.
ritual.
Well, meals are really important, right? So we have this thing called high-low buffalo.
Oh, yes.
Which is we go over what a high for them today is and a low from the day. and then the buffalo, which is the funny thing that happened that day.
So it
And
starts out as being good parenting, and then it moves in. It's like a habit, and then it
Yeah.
moves into ritual.
No, but that's a great example to
Yeah.
give structure to time. Because that's sort of the space every day that you do.
And it
you do
facilitates
something.
human connection. I mean,
Yeah.
so this is the point about the practices that for me is so important is, humans, anthropologists tell us, had ritual before we had language. So it's, whether it's moving our bodies to the same beat or whether it's finding shared actions to do with food or nature, something, it's the way in which we feel connected to one another. So I love high-low buffalo. I know, like, rose, bud, and thorn, but high-low buffalo is better. That's great.
So now, but one thing I'm interested in is as you look at all of the kind of remixing, sort of challenges, negotiations that are happening today. Like, is there a framework that you apply that says, like, yes, this is net positive, a sort of an innovation that is aligned or good, versus things which are sort of pathological or bad, and because change happens, but I think not always in a good way. And so, like, what do you look at to say actually, like, this is the Casper, like, quality seal of approval for some new ritual or some activity that you see out there?
Yeah. So at Sacred Design Lab, we talk about centering.
Can you tell folks
Oh,
what
yeah.
Sacred
Yeah, let's
Design
get into
Lab
that.
Oh,
is?
sorry. Yes. So that's the organization I run with my two
Such a
co-founders.
great name, right?
Oh, I'm glad you like it.
I
We
think
spent
we
a
all
long
wanna-
time thinking about it.
Okay, well, it was well worth it.
Thank you. So we try and think about, human-centered design is this wonderful approach that we're all familiar with that centers immediate human needs. And the way we tried to think about centering these sacred questions was to think about three things that our souls long for, if I can use that word. So the longing for belonging, a sense of connection, not just to other people, but also to place, to a sense of time, a sense of ancestry maybe, a story that we're part of. The second one is to think about becoming. So how do I become the person that I want to be?
Okay, so this is past and future.
Ooh.
Yeah, this is Jane and I. We've been emailing about her interest in the future, and I like future, but I like the past a lot.
Yeah.
So this is past and this is future.
Every tradition was once an innovation. So yeah. Belonging, becoming, and then the third one is beyond. So how do we connect with something beyond ourselves? That sense of transcendence, something that makes us feel, like a night sky can make us feel both fully part of it and yet totally minuscule at the same time. I like to think of that as right-sizing the human ego, right? When we're just as worthy as anyone else, but no more, no less.
Right.
So belonging, becoming, beyond, that's kind of the framework that we use to think about, is this practice going to serve the needs that people have today?
And what's something that you've uncovered through this? What are some examples that people here should know about and check out?
Yeah, so there's what's really exciting is that there is significant innovation in the spirituality space.
Okay, but it's not just like New Age angel cards that I could get, right?
And
Well,
frankly, like cobbling together your like Peloton and then your yoga class, that's not innovation, right? Is it?
I think there are ways in which it is. So,
Okay,
for example.
But how does Peloton help you think about beyond?
Oh, because Peloton is a group religious thing, and some of
Well, no, it's certainly belonging,
But it's not helping
possibly
you think of
becoming in
beyond,
a
yeah.
narrow sense. But how? I mean, the sense of the transcendent on.
And it's
What's her name? Love on Sundays.
Yeah, exactly.
Allie Love. You're right.
Allie- yeah.
She's preaching, right? Like,
Yeah.
that's really true.
I didn't realize she was preaching, and I kind of liked it. I got a Peloton, and then I read this. I was like, oh,
Yeah,
I think
poo-poo.
I cried a couple of times. Even just last week, I was like, oh, I'm so emotional these days. Actually, it was just Allie Love preaching to me.
Well, and the fact that your body was exercising,
Yeah,
because it
yeah.
reduces our kind of inner cynicism
Yeah.
when we're in those environments.
she's so cheery. Yeah.
But one good example maybe that comes from kind of the religious world into the secular world is One Table. I don't know if anyone
No, I don't
come
know what
across
that is.
One Table. So it's a wonderful organization that looked at Judaism as a whole and said, what's at the very heart of what we love about this Jewish tradition? It's Shabbat. And how can we help people celebrate Shabbat without having to engage in everything else in synagogue life or accept all sorts of other elements of Jewish life that people may not want? And so what they do is they built a technology platform that helps you organize a dinner for Friday night. and it gives you some money to go buy groceries.
What is it called again?
One Table.
Oh yes, I went to their
Yeah.
website the other day. They have a whole app. It's quite
It's-
busy. There's like a lot of dinners
There's
going
a
on.
lot of dinners on Friday
We
night.
literally
Was
looked
it-
at it and we were like, we should build a Posthoc app.
But it takes out some of the
Yeah.
stresses of organizing an event and helps make it more accessible in that way. And another example, I'm going to riff with Judaism here. The same founder actually created, so in Jewish tradition you have the mikveh, which is the kind of ritual bath, which was used at various moments, but included in a menstrual cycle, for example, women would go to the mikveh after having their period. And so it is, in most Jewish circles, people think of it as quite a conservative, kind of old-fashioned thing. Good or not, I'm not saying. But the innovation was to say, actually, what a beautiful example of a moment in which you can mark a transition. Why don't we make a mikveh available when you go through a divorce, or when you go through a gender transition, or you graduate? And you don't have to use maybe the traditional prayers if you want to sing the latest Adele track as you fully submerge underwater, not wearing makeup or jewelry, then let's help you design your own kind of transformative experience. So often it's where the kind of popular culture meets these ancient practices that it can become remixed and relevant to a whole new group of
There
people.
is a lot of office space right now, and as companies are sort of figuring out the next year or two, and people working at home and sometimes working in the office, are you advising any of them and how they might reuse their office space?
Yes, and. We were actually involved advising Pinterest on their new head office before COVID hit, because they wanted spaces for community and ritual in the office space. Because what they found was a number of people who worked there didn't have space to host dinners at their house, and they knew human connection was important. And so they wanted to include having places where people could eat together.
And so what would it look like? I'm sorry, I want to get into the design of it. Were they nice? Or was it-
Fireplaces.
You start with a tree that has two hooks.
Yeah. But
the
how
imperfection of it. How do you make it imperfect?
I was going to say, they need you, because you would have been the perfect person to
Please,
talk to.
you know, we were for hire at Posthoc.
But in terms of how to reimagine space now,
Yeah.
I think one of the big conversations is what is in-person for and what is digital for. And so when you have both, how do you lean into the things that you can only do when you're in person? So Google, for example, has bought a forest where people can go on walks together. Because
That's the most Google thing.
And I
There's
saw
also something called the national parks. You don't need to own the forest.
I
In fact,
saw
actually,
Mark
that's-
is buying a ranch, I think, right? For sales, I don't know, I'm looking at you. But Mark Benioff, I think, was musing the other day about buying a ranch because of the importance of people getting together within Salesforce.
And I think that pattern in terms of work is going to look a lot like the changing pattern of religious life, where you're not going to be together every week on a Sunday morning or Saturday or Friday night, whatever, for an in-person experience, but you're going to go for maybe quarterly, much deeper dive retreats that are multi-day or a sort of summer camp experience, or something that's intense and personal without screens, that then sustains you for the next however long until people come together again. So
that makes me a bit sad.
what
You have to be sustained until the next time. I don't know. I quite like it every day.
I mean, who doesn't? And I think who doesn't want to move into some sort of like
Well, I mean,
cooperative
maybe I would,
living?
but you know what
Well,
I mean.
when's the last time you've been to an office every day? Like that's not not gonna work this out.
I mean, I would. It's nice to be gathered though every day.
Well, I think the
That's what
general
I mean.
point
I mean
is
it
like
like
there's an
gathering.
analogy that I use with work where it's the office used to be a space of control, where it was like a demarcation between the outside world and and what happens, and so it was to organize space and time to control that for the employees that you had hired, and I think it's going to move from a fortress analogy to something more like a kitchen, actually, to Susan's point, a place of sustenance. You come in with things that you can only get in person.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
Has Templeton? I mean, I know you have, but can you tell us about some of the funding research around ritual or?
Like quite a bit of sort of mapping ritual around the world in different, sort of like to understand, how certain ritualized practices aid in moral decision making or actually pro-social behavior. So we have a study right now that is looking at actually on the issue of fasting and religiously inspired fasting, and whether fasting, which has some kind of transcendent element to it, actually, through randomized controlled trials, actually shows more pro-social benefit than fasting that doesn't have that kind of, dieting, for example, as a sort of an example of this kind of effect of ritual on well-being.
Does religion do something to our brain?
Oh, no doubt.
I mean, that's the whole point, actually, I think.
Scientifically?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
sure.
this is one of the exciting things, and meditation is, the most well-researched one at this point.
Yeah, there's a cool book called Why We Need Religion by Stephen Asma, he's an atheist, and he says that religion is. He argues that it's the most sophisticated form of human culture to manage human emotions. So, like processes of joy and grief, and anger. Like sort of, the kind of looking at all the practices around religion are, the most powerful examples of that.
And this is, I think, the answer, or at least pointing to an answer of the core question of does God need an R&D lab?
Hey, well, that's
well, no, and it needs many, right? There's
Yeah.
certainly no one who's going to figure this out. But essentially, we know that it's important. But for so many people, we can't believe the story or the theology that we've been given. So that there's this sense of desiring.
There's a difference between story and practice, right?
Yes, and we don't have the kind of meaning-making layer that holds these practices together, that we're willing to submit to them fully. And I think that's one of the key questions theologically is how do we talk about God in a way that it feels real and powerful and not a man in the sky with a trident?
Sandeep, can I put you on the spot for a second? Sandeep's a cardiologist, and we did a salon last week in LA.
Just back from a great success on the West Coast, everyone.
Great success, Posthoc Salon on the West Coast.
Yeah.
But do you see patients come in? Have you ever noticed a patient who's like religious or not religious and how it affects their heart at all, or believing in anything? Or
Yeah, definitely. Actually, there was. Thank you.
oh, that's so nice of you.
There have been studies on prayer, both on your behalf as well as by patients, that show that outcomes after heart surgery are better in patients who have
A belief.
this, sort of belief or this structure to their lives. It's fascinating. And as you pointed out, meditation has tremendous benefits on the heart that we're only just now coming to understand. Because, in part because for the longest time, cardiologists didn't recognize stress as a risk factor for heart disease. And it's only really in the last probably 20, 30 years where we're starting to see the effects of stress on heart disease, both in a chronic and acute way. So meditation, yoga, prayer are therapies that we're just starting.
Are health insurance companies encouraging this or beginning to? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, one of the big things that the healthcare world is really cottoning onto is the damaging impact of loneliness, and so the necessity of social connection. But hospitals are really bad at building community, and so, and frankly, a medical approach to thinking about relationships often is like, okay, I'm a doctor, you're a patient, let me prescribe you an art class in which you'll find all of the other lonely people that I also prescribed to go to art class, and so like the vibe is not that good. So you're seeing healthcare, you're seeing hospitals and healthcare providers really trying to reimagine who is a healthcare provider. And so one of the things I'm really interested in is, can we start to see community builders, religious leaders, people who run recovery circles as providing a really important and powerful healthcare delivery.
And I think that was the last maybe question we had, which was sort of like in like 5 to 10 years, you talk about this with healthcare, but like what's next for church? What's next for work? What's next for school? Taking some of the insights that you've learned over the past few years.
Yeah, I think we'll continue to see institutional religious decline, as we talked about. I think the workplace is going to become not necessarily the location, right? Meditation classes, yoga classes at work. I think they're going to become...
Or SFO, airports maybe, right?
Yes, exactly. But I think they will become the conduit. So
Okay.
you're already starting to see not just kind of personal development budgets, but an essential investment in employees, that they have a coach, that they have a small group of peers, that essentially the workplace is the way in which people will access spiritual community, which brings up all sorts of questions around access and wealth. So I think that's one trend. I think you'll see more and more the religiousization. That's not a real
What does
word.
that mean?
But essentially, like the way in which political identity now has replaced religious identity. This sense of total kind of willingness
You
to
can say zealotry.
zealotry, yeah, and just a sense of like turning political leaders, and we're seeing this obviously with Trump most powerfully, that people are willing to be martyrs for the cause. And so religion moving into different areas of political and public life, because it's not a static thing. That's such a legacy of the Reformation. For all the good it gave us, it did give us that.
Do we have any questions here? Yes, George, from the front row.
One thing that hasn't really been talked about much in this is the human soul. And actually, and you would know better than I, but most of the world's major religions are really preoccupied with the soul and how purified it is. Many of the rituals we have are designed specifically to help us, achieve some sort of higher purpose, but really the manifestation of our souls. And I'm just curious, given the context of today, how you see rituals helping to manifest our human souls.
What a beautiful question. I think we don't think we have souls most of the time. The kind of the secular world. I think so much of religious practice, like meditation, gets put into a kind of growth mindset frame of becoming better, of achieving more, of being more productive. When at least in my theological imagination, that's not what the soul is for. The soul is already perfect. And so I think so much of, I hope, good ritual can do is to help us come home to the sufficiency of who we are. I like to, who was I talking to before? Was it Grant, who's Baptist?
Yeah,
Baptist?
Grant, yeah.
Yeah. So this is my favorite Baptist preacher line, which is essentially like, God loves you just the way you are, but too much for you to stay the same. Which I just love, because it makes space for the sufficiency of what is, but also points to that invitation towards growth. But the ordering of those two is so important, that we don't start with you have to be different from who you are, but that we start with that you are entirely beloved and good, and because of that you can give more, etc. So that was probably slightly diagonal to the question that you were asking. But essentially, I just don't think there is a rich popular imagination about what our souls are. The best one is Harry Potter. I really think so, right?
Are you plugging the podcast here?
I'm certainly going to plug the podcast
Do it.
called
Go
Harry
for it.
Potter and the Sacred Text. Been running now 6 years, where we read every chapter and treat it like
Listen,
a sacred
tell
text.
people about it, because
Yeah, tell me, yeah.
Well,
folks
no,
don't
but
know.
let me just
I
finish
did
this
not-
whole thing.
Say that again. Harry Potter and the Sacred Text.
But-
Found wherever you get your
Wherever you listen.
It was
podcast.
a number one podcast. This is
Number two.
okay.
But Voldemort rips his soul apart as he kills people, right? Like he creates the Horcruxes, and I'm not sure where else we're confronted by the horror of what happens when you murder someone for your own gain, outside of Voldemort. So I'm building that bridge slightly.
Jane, yeah? Oh, this is nice.
I love
a roving
what you
mic.
said. So I'm curious,
I should-
what
I
about
should do
the darker side of religion? The guilt, the punishing aspect to make you want to be good. Does that make you come back too?
Yeah.
Has
The,
anyone
the
seen-
atomic bomb.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
different things. Yeah, right.
No, religion is like fire. It can be a candle, a hearth, a stovetop, but it can also burn your life down. I think of it as a it's a technology, right? And we can do horrific things with technologies. Certainly in the radicalization, the polarization, I think that is true. What's really interesting, looking at evangelicals, although acceptance and support for same-sex relationships is way higher generationally, the views on abortion are exactly the same as they were 50 years ago. So there are still some issues where that polarization is very true.
But do you think, to press on that point, do
Yeah.
you think this model of becoming, belonging, and beyond doesn't really, it's not normative. It doesn't give you a judgment about whether something is pathologic or beneficial, and what's required to make that differentiation.
Yes, it is certainly a postmodern approach. And for sure, some people long for certainty and long for structure that this approach would not give. And they will find it somewhere. I think I would not be surprised if in the next 10 years we see a whole slew of new religious movements or cults, essentially places that give answers in the midst of so much uncertainty.
Are there any I introduced you to this fellow he thought about setting up an innovation fund in LA to invest in religious startups. Is there anything like that going on right now?
Yes.
Lots of it.
Yeah, I mean, usually it's individuals.
It's individuals, right?
But yeah,
Okay.
you see, I mean, Hallow is a new app with all sorts of Catholic practices, for example. So absolutely, religion is moving and has been online for some time. And you're going to see, again, I think more and more those things being specifically targeted, not as a whole life 360. You're going to find your children's Sunday school here, plus your experience of...
Actually, I can't remember his name. We had the fellow who founded Pray.com.
Yeah, Steve.
Steve, yeah, Steve.
What a character.
Yeah.
Well, so here's an example. So
Pray.com.
UMass,
Pray.com.
yeah,
Steve
Pray.com.
created Pray.com, which is essentially...
In 2015, he had a traumatic friend died or something, right?
Yeah, in a helicopter crash. And essentially created this platform in which people can pray together. They can share their prayers, they can ask for prayers, they can pray for the world in certain moments. And he's an entrepreneur, right? That's what he does, and he has a deep faith himself. But now he's suddenly realizing, hang on, as is true with so many innovators who are working in this space, I'm not just running a business, I'm not just running a nonprofit.
Right.
I am like a mega church
You're like the leader.
Yes.
Yeah, he's like the leader. He's very tall.
Yes.
Too. He comes in like that.
And so he is setting essentially the theological foundations for millions of people who are using this app. Poor guy is completely terrified by that responsibility, and as he should be, frankly.
Yeah.
And so the question about the darker side, I don't want to use that language, the more dangerous side of religion, frankly, is when leadership is not in integrity. And I think as we step away from so many of the institutions, some of the things we lose are those structures of support and accountability.
More questions?
I'm gonna just. Thank you. Hi. Nice to meet you guys.
This is Jane, everyone. She's in
Hi.
from Berkeley.
Hi. I am curious about this because the organization of religion, or more to the point, the organization of churches, has for many years, of course, been a tax dodge, tax haven. I'm super interested in the movement of mindfulness-based stress reduction into the workplace.
Yeah.
And I'm looking at the very, very big business that represents. I have a friend who works for the Potential Project. I don't know if you're familiar with them. And they are getting big clients all over the world, but they're competing with McKinsey and Deloitte. I mean, do you want to learn mindfulness from Deloitte?
Only through PowerPoint.
Yeah, totally, exactly. And so I'm just really curious about the commercialization of this. I remember meeting the people at Yoga Journal when it went from being a thing driven by Buddhism and by yoga practice to being a for-profit magazine, and that was 20 years ago or something. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are on the commercialization of this, and does it dovetail at some point with a total change, a radical change in our own sense of spirituality?
Yes, Jane, I love this.
Great question.
In 2018, Vice released a report saying, brands have moved into politics, Colin Kaepernick, et cetera. The next white space in branding is spirituality. And so, is spirituality. And so 100% yes, that is happening. And there is deep, not just resentment, but existential fear about how it changes the practices, right? Headspace is a great example. Andy, who was one of the founders of Headspace, had been just about to take his final vows as a monk, came back and said, no, I want to create this thing called Headspace. And even the color palette is inspired by the robes of the monks from the monastery that he was in. It's beautiful. However, the market has pushed the product to move from the shortest meditation being 20 minutes to being 5 minutes, to being 1 minute. And now a significant part, if not most of their income, comes from corporate clients who provide Headspace as a benefit to
They
their
as a
employees.
business have done a really good job with that, and Calm has tried to compete on getting the corporate clients.
Exactly.
But has a very different
But it
brand.
has fundamentally changed the
Yeah.
practice. So far I'm saying yes to your question. Here's the no, which is that, again, we think of religion as being this thing that's pure on a hill and it's always been separate from the world. Capital and religion have always interacted. Even if in its most beautiful kind of imaginations, right? Jesus turning the table in the temple, all of that. Mostly money and religion have always lived side by side and influenced one another. So although I'm saying yes, and it's scary to your question, I also don't want to think that it's something new. It has always been true. Selling indulgences is the obvious Western example. Yes, and is what I would say. Yeah.
Take one over on this side and we'll come right here in the center.
All right. So first and foremost, I just want to say thank you so much for the discussion. One of the things that really strikes me right now is here we are in 2021, and the Supreme Court's about to probably strike down Roe v. Wade. You have obviously Amy Barrett, Comey Barrett, Brett Kavanaugh, a majority Catholic Supreme Court. I guess I would be more on the side of investigating this through the prism of the Matrix rather than Harry Potter. But
Nice.
you know, the eerie thing is, how do we think about this notion of cognitive dissonance? Because so many of the religions that you've been discussing come out of this notion of kind of a toxic cocktail of suppression of your notion of transcendence. Like, if you're going to go to heaven, you got to pay a papal indulgence. Then you have Martin Luther. Then you have wars. Then you have Marxism, which one could argue is also kind of religion, et cetera, et cetera. So fast forward to 2021. And then you have stuff like Burning Man, which one could argue is a kind of a permutation engine of kinds of religious impulse as well. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, because it seems like we're looking at the most trusted man in evangelical Christianity was Trump, which one could argue is a lunatic move. I mean, it's like lemmings wearing suicide vests. So I would just love to hear, the white Christian evangelical scene is deeply complicit in things like the prison industrial system,
Yes.
and of course, the grift, you know, of what's going on right now. So yeah, I just would love to. It's a little bit slightly more of a cynical take on things, but
No,
yeah, we'd love to hear that.
As we should have. I totally appreciate that. The thing is, I think it's less about religion and it's more about conservatism. Because if you go back 50 years, Catholics in America were split half and half on being pro-choice or pro-life. It was not inherent to Catholicism to have that perspective. You know, most of the people who now claim an evangelical identity are not active churchgoers. And so there is a real divide between the reality of a lived religious life, even if I disagree with many of the kind of theological and political commitments. And I think the way in which capitalism and empire and racism and these essentially forces that are beyond but go through religion have shaped the political imagination. So I'm saying yes and, because I obviously, like, I'm a gay man, like religion's been fucking awful. So I don't want to gloss over the horrors that are real. But at the same time, I think in terms of what to look for about what gives me hope and can be shaped, there's more in religion than I found anywhere else, including progressive political activism. Yeah.
Should we do one or two more questions?
Oh yeah. So, okay. Can everyone hear me? Yeah. Cool. All right. So here's my question. So I'm a technology lawyer. I do deals day in, day out about, you know, get to see where technology is going, like in a year, in 2 years, in 3 years. I'm also an engineer. And engineers are typically very logical and not thinking very much about kind of the human, just kind of what logically makes sense, yes, no. So how do you think religion should influence the development of technology? Like, if you were to like inject a religious kind of perspective into the, you know, Googles and Facebooks of the world, how would you change the path of technology?
That's a beautiful question. The obvious answer is to go down the ethical route, but that has been tried and I find it less than inspiring. The thing that I get most excited about is the bigger questions of what is technology for. And I think if we had a metric which centered human flourishing, to use that language, which was more rigorous than let's connect everyone, or let's help people create, that really centered those archetypical, we use this language of belonging, becoming, and beyond. How does it help us do those things? If yes, then yes. If no, then we won't build it. That kind of framework would be something I'd be really interested in. I'm just as interested in how technology should shape the religion of the future, to kind of turn it the other way, because Ilia Delio is this wonderful theologian who was a scientist in her training, and so she uses scientific and technology language essentially to communicate her understanding of God. And so much of the kind of traditional, at least in the Western world, the language for God was agricultural. It was based on the culture and the tools and the experiences of the time. And so now as we live, like we are already, I'll get my phone, it's in this one. We are already kind of bionic people. How is technology going to shape our understanding and imagination of what God is and how it works? So I wouldn't want to walk into a room with those people with a kind of moralistic, like, this is what you should do. I'm just as interested in how learning about the world through that frame can shape our imagination of what God is.
Any other questions? Yes. We just met. I can't remember your name. I'm sorry.
I'm Jordan.
Jordan, nice to meet you.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah. So one, thanks for the conversation. This is fantastic. And I'm a reformed Jew, which means I'm an incredible atheist. But I strongly believe in the power of community. And I've been rephrasing this whole conversation around that notion of community. And it's, definitely resonates with me. But I also have a fairly deeply personal dilemma, which I'm curious about your perspective, which is I run a small business, about 150 people or so, and I see the need for community.
Yeah.
But I also,
Yes.
I see the opportunity to deliver community to my company, to my employees. But I also have this strong conviction that I shouldn't deliver that they should get that community somewhere else. How do I deal with that sort of dilemma? Because in the US, they're not getting it elsewhere.
Correct.
And how do I deal with that conundrum, I guess?
Yeah. I really appreciate you sharing that, Jordan, because this is something we experience with employers all of the time. Both on a kind of, we know it would help them be productive, but also just like on a moral, like, I love these people. I want them to be happy. You can't be in community with people if I can fire you.
That's true. Yeah, there we go.
And so I think it's very,
excommunication.
Well, I mean jokingly.
I'm not
but
joking.
that is how it's experienced.
Yeah.
That is how it's experienced. Because if this is the place that I go to find meaning, connection, and purpose, and now you're throwing me out, not just because of my livelihood, because these are my friends. This is the place that I narrated my sense of purpose through. So that's why I'm saying I don't think we should locate it in the office. But I do think you can connect people to, and frankly pay for, those pathways towards.
Here. Remember?
This
is how we were introduced earlier. Like, you should underwrite a post-excellency right here.
and there's community, and then there's new organizations that are designed to do this. So Medley is one, the Grand is one, which are essentially small groups of people who are paid for by their work to share a question over a certain amount of time. Should I have kids? What do I do about my aging parents? How do me and my partner manage infertility? How do I find purpose? Those kind of questions that are juicy and good and real, that really matter to people. And you pay for their time and for the people who facilitate those conversations. I think that's where we're going and what is needed.
I think maybe we'll end on that. And if anyone okay, Edward, one more. And then if anyone has any further questions,
He'll be here.
He'll be here, or he can go back in my office. Edward, hi.
Oh, sorry.
Because you always ask such great questions. He's so philosophical, I can't.
I just would love to hear your thoughts on QAnon as a religious movement, because I think they're doing an incredible job at using rituals, using the whole thing of if you do your research right, you're pure, and then you have to help others, who are sinful and fuck babies in pizza parlors. And so I would love to hear your views.
What was the group? What was the
QAnon.
QAnon. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, the most powerful thing QAnon does for most of its members is to provide a community of belonging and a sense of shared purpose. And so part of the whole, like, we're going to expose the, pedophile ring is to give the most intense form of righteous purpose that can be found. Most people, so the Mormon Church is another good example. Like, most people don't become Mormon because they really believe the Mormon theology. They become Mormon because they like the people they're hanging out with and they happen to be Mormon. And so that is part of, I think part of it too is just like, oh, these might be my people. We have a shared activity.